Volatility is compressing near the 120 moving average while price interacts with overlapping session boundaries formed earlier this week. The structure visible on the chart does not begin today. It began forming several sessions earlier. On March 4th, the Asia session anchor established a structural box that defined the working range of interaction for the following session cycle. Later, during the March 5th US session, a new anchor candle formed almost exactly around that same positional region. This matters because relocation did not occur immediately. The session simply reproduced structural memory. Two anchors occupying similar positional space create density. Density increases interaction frequency. Price did not immediately extend away from that zone. Instead, interaction concentrated around it. But continuation did not persist inside that containment. The market eventually moved outside that local session box and interacted with the lower boundary of the March 4th US session anchor range. That interaction introduced the first visible displacement in the sequence. However, displacement alone does not define structural relocation. Relocation requires persistence. Persistence requires duration. Without duration, displacement remains a temporary excursion. The following session cycle reinforced this tension. During the March 5th Asia session, a new anchor formed precisely near the lower boundary of the March 4th US session range. This is a structural handoff between sessions. Asia did not define a new field of interaction. Instead, it inherited the lower boundary created by the previous US session. Price then began rotating around that boundary rather than expanding away from it. Rotation increases interaction frequency, but it reduces directional clarity. Distance remained limited. The center of the Asia session box became the focal point of negotiation. This is where volatility behavior begins to reveal structural pressure. Compression begins quietly, not through inactivity, but through repeated interaction at the same structural boundary. When interaction concentrates around the same level repeatedly, tolerance narrows. The margin for error contracts. Continuation attempts stall faster. Retracement depth begins to increase. This is the behavioral shift that often precedes a deeper relocation attempt. But at that moment, relocation had not yet occurred. Price remained inside the structural memory created by the overlapping session anchors. The chart was already processing tension. The environment was compressing. Execution conditions were beginning to change. But the structural field had not yet transitioned. The structure was still negotiating. The compression phase became clearer when the lower boundary interaction began extending deeper into older session memory. After rotating around the March 5th Asia session box, price eventually moved beyond its lower boundary. This interaction connected directly with an earlier structural reference, the lower boundary of the February 8th Asia session anchor. When current interaction reaches a much older anchor level, structural time expands. Older anchors carry heavier structural memory. They tend to slow movement. They also increase reaction density. At this stage, price interacted with the lower portion of that older anchor and then continued moving downward toward another nearby structural reference, the upper boundary of the March 3rd Asia session anchor box. This sequence created a layered overlap. Multiple anchors from different sessions began interacting inside the same vertical region. Overlap increases structural density. Structural density changes execution conditions. Distance tolerance shrinks. Pullbacks deepen before stabilizing. Continuation attempts begin failing more frequently. And the chart begins to exhibit what looks like movement without relocation. That is not randomness. It is compression produced by overlapping structural memory. The environment becomes more sensitive to interaction. Small movements produce stronger reactions, but continuation remains limited. This is why structural interpretation cannot rely only on visible volatility. Visible movement does not equal structural transition. The market may appear active, but activity inside overlapping containment rarely produces immediate relocation. The March 6th US session illustrates this dynamic clearly. The anchor formed during that session overlapped almost exactly with the March 3rd Asia session anchor. Two anchors separated by several days were now occupying nearly the same positional region. This is a structural convergence. Convergence amplifies interaction, but it also restricts distance. Instead of expanding away from the overlapping anchors, price remained close to the lower boundary of the US session box. Distance did not expand. It remained compressed. This type of behavior changes the environment in subtle ways. Execution tolerance narrows. Continuation attempts stall quickly. Pullbacks extend deeper before stabilizing. Holding pressure increases. Not because the structure has relocated, but because the structure has not yet relocated. The market is processing overlapping structural memory. Time is being absorbed. Energy is redistributing. The chart appears busy, but structurally it is compressing. The environment is building pressure inside a confined field of interaction, and that compression eventually led to the next session transition. The most recent structural layer emerged during the March 8th Asia session. A new session anchor formed between two earlier structural centers. Above it sits the midpoint of the March 3rd US session anchor box. Below it sits the midpoint of the March 1st Asia session anchor box. This means the current session anchor formed inside an existing structural corridor, not at a new boundary, but between two older ones. Corridor environments create a specific type of behavior. They encourage testing. Price moves from one boundary to the other without establishing immediate relocation. This is exactly what the chart is currently processing. Interaction is now occurring near the upper portion of that corridor. Price is repeatedly testing two nearby structural references: the upper boundary of the March 3rd US session anchor and the lower boundary of the March 6th US session anchor box. When two boundaries sit close together, the space between them becomes a reaction zone. Volatility may appear to increase, but distance rarely expands immediately. This is where execution conditions become particularly sensitive. Tolerance width contracts. Continuation attempts can fail quickly, but displacement attempts may also accelerate unexpectedly. Both behaviors become possible in dense structural corridors. The 120 moving average is also positioned nearby. Its slope has begun flattening. When a longer moving average flattens inside overlapping session boundaries, structural weight redistributes. Distance expectations shift. Pullbacks deepen before stabilizing. Continuation requires more persistence. Without persistence, movement returns toward the corridor's center. Bollinger Band behavior reflects this compression as well. The 20 bandwidth is narrowing. The shorter 4 band continues to oscillate sharply around price. This combination often indicates localized volatility inside broader containment. It creates movement, but not necessarily relocation. The environment therefore becomes executionally demanding. Reaction speed requirements increase. Tolerance margins narrow. Distance expectations remain uncertain. If compression continues between these overlapping session boundaries, interaction may remain contained within the corridor. If displacement begins to persist beyond one of the anchor levels, the environment could begin transitioning toward a wider structural field. But persistence must appear before relocation can be confirmed. Until then, the structure remains in negotiation. Environment is still processing.